Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 68. This episode was ready to go yesterday on Thanksgiving, but somehow it didn't seem quite right to be publishing an episode on JFK's autopsy on Thanksgiving Day. I do hope each and every one of you had a wonderful Thanksgiving, and that if you're blessed this week with an extra day off, you'll be able to find some time over this long weekend to listen to what will be several episodes published as we continue our autopsy series. As you know, when we did the series on the Zapruder film and when we did the Dealey Plaza series, both those series mushroomed in terms of coverage and morphed into quite a few episodes, quite a few parts, if you will, to cover the topic in the way that we wanted to. And the same has already begun to happen here, I suppose. I am trying to keep as many of these episodes as possible to around 30 to 40 minutes each, which is my target length for an episode. That should make it easier to digest. As you know, the Siebert and O'Neill FBI 302 report is the closest we have to a true evidential storytell of the assassination autopsy. And as you know, I really have a preference for going back to the official documents and understanding what's in them first, before we begin to analyze what's right and wrong or what's in conflict, and really before we do any major storytelling. And so I've been out of sequence a little bit in this series already with some of the things that we're doing here in the story of the autopsy, but it's still early on, early enough that it's probably just the right time to introduce the Siebert and O'Neill report in its entirety. It's actually not long at all, and it's chock full of important facts that document what went on in the autopsy, and it also brings up some interesting questions as well. So let's read it together, and that way you'll have a chance to listen to it in its entirety. Like I said, it's not very long, and I think you will find it interesting. Listen closely because there are lots of things that should stick out to you as you listen in. And when we get done, I'll reemphasize some of the more important matters that have been included and that we'll need to keep top of mind as we are evaluating all of this information. As jurors, this is an important part of the evidence being presented. In the episode that follows this one, we are going to do something similar with the actual autopsy report itself, which is even shorter than the Siebert and O'Neill report, and has even less relevant information in it. But again, it is an official report that we need to spend a little bit of time with as we wander through this part of the story. So, here we go. Without further ado, let's listen to episode 68 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. At approximately 3 p.m. on November 22, 1963, following the president's announced assassination, it was ascertained that Air Force One, the president's jet, was returning from Love Field, Dallas, Texas, flying the body back to Andrews Air Force Base, Camp Springs, Maryland. Special Agents Francis X. O'Neill, Jr. and James W. Siebert proceeded to Andrews Air Force Base to handle any matters which would fall within the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, inasmuch as it was anticipated that a large group of both military and civilian personnel assigned to the base would congregate at base operations to witness the landing of this flight. Lieutenant Colonel Robert T. Best, who was the Director of Law Enforcement and Security, advised the president's plane would arrive at 5:25 p.m. Subsequently, Colonel Best advised that the plane would arrive at 6:05 p.m. At approximately 5:55 p.m., agents were advised through the Hyattsville Resident Agency that the Bureau had instructed that the agents accompany the body to the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, to stay with the body and to obtain bullets reportedly in the president's body. Immediately, agents contacted Mr. James Rowley, the director of the U.S. Secret Service, identified themselves, and made Mr. Rowley aware of our aforementioned instruction. Immediately following the plane's landing, Mr. Rowley arranged seating for bureau agents in the third car of the White House motorcade, which followed the ambulance containing the president's body to the Naval Medical Center, Bethesda, Maryland. On arrival at the medical center, the ambulance stopped in front of the main entrance, at which time Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy embarked from the ambulance and entered the building. The ambulance was, thereafter, driven around to the rear entrance where the president's body was removed and taken into an autopsy room. Bureau agents assisted in the moving of the casket to the autopsy room. A tight security was immediately placed around the autopsy room by the naval facility and the U.S. Secret Service agents. The agents made contact with Mr. Roy Kellerman, the Assistant Secret Service agent in charge of the White House detail, and advised him of the Bureau's interest in this matter. He advised that he had already received instructions from Director Rowley as to the presence of the Bureau agents. It will be noted that the aforementioned Bureau agents and Mr. Roy Kellerman, Mr. William Greer, and Mr. William O'Leary, Secret Service agents, were the only personnel other than medical personnel present during the autopsy. The following individuals attended the autopsy: Admiral C.E. Holloway, U.S. Navy, commanding officer of the U.S. Naval Medical Center in Bethesda; Admiral Berkeley, U.S. Navy, the President's personal physician; Commander James J. Humes, Chief Pathologist, Bethesda Naval Hospital, who conducted autopsy; Captain James H. Stover, Jr., Commanding Officer of the Naval Medical School, Bethesda; Mr. John T. Stringer, Jr., Medical Photographer; James H. Ebersol, Lloyd Rabe, J. T. Bajel, J. G. Rudnicki, Paul O'Connor, J. C. Jenkins, Gerald Crester, Edward F. Reed, and James Metler. During the course of the autopsy, Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Fink, U.S. Army Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, arrived to assist Commander Humes in the autopsy. In addition, Lieutenant Commander Greg Cross and Captain David Osborne, Chief of Surgery, entered the autopsy room. Major General Wheel, commanding officer of the U.S. Military District of Washington, D.C., entered the autopsy room to ascertain from the Secret Service agents concerning the transportation of the president's body back to the White House. Chester from the U.S. Navy visited the autopsy room during the final stages of such to type receipts given by FBI and Secret Service for items obtained at the termination of the autopsy. The following personnel from Gawler's funeral home entered the autopsy room to prepare the president's body for burial: John Van Hazen, Edwin Strobel, Thomas Robinson, and Mr. Hagen. Brigadier General Godfrey McHugh, Air Force military aide to the president, was also present, as was Dr. George Bakeman, U.S. Navy. Arrangements were made for the performance of the autopsy by the U.S. Navy and Secret Service. The president's body was removed from the casket in which it had been transported and was placed on the autopsy table, at which time the complete body was wrapped in a sheet and the head area contained an additional wrapping which was saturated with blood. Following the removal of the wrapping, it was ascertained that the president's clothing had been removed, and it was also apparent that a tracheotomy had been performed, as well as surgery of the head area, namely in the top of the skull. All personnel, with the exception of medical officers needed in the taking of the photographs and x-rays, were requested to leave the autopsy room and remain in an adjacent room. Upon completion of x-rays and photographs, the first incision was made at 8:15 p.m. X-rays of the brain area, which were developed and returned to the autopsy room, disclosed a path of a missile which appeared to enter the back of the skull, and the path of the disintegrated fragments could be observed along the right side of the skull. The largest section of this missile, as portrayed by X-ray, appeared to be behind the right frontal sinus. The next largest fragment appeared to be at the rear of the skull, at the juncture of the skull bone. The chief pathologist advised approximately 40 particles of disintegrated bullet and smudges indicated that the projectile had fragmentized while passing through the skull region. During the autopsy inspection of the area of the brain, 2 fragments of metal were removed by Dr. Humes, namely one fragment measuring 7 by 2 millimeters, which was removed from the right side of the brain. An additional fragment of metal measuring 1 by 3 millimeters was also removed from this area, both of which were placed in a glass jar containing a black metal top, which were thereafter marked for identification and, following the signing of a proper receipt, were transported by Bureau agents to the FBI laboratory during the latter stages of this autopsy. Dr. Humes located an opening, which appeared to be a bullet hole, which was below the shoulders and 2 inches to the right of the middle line of the spinal column. This opening was probed by Dr. Humes with the finger, at which time it was determined that the trajectory of the missile entering at this point had entered at a downward position of 45 to 60 degrees. Further probing determined that the distance traveled by this missile was a short distance, inasmuch as the end of the opening could be felt with the finger. Inasmuch as no complete bullet of any size could be located in the brain area, and likewise no bullet could be located in the back or any other area of the body, as determined by total body X-rays and inspection as well, revealing there was no point of exit. The individuals performing the autopsy were at a loss to explain why they could find no bullets. A call was made by Bureau agents to the firearms section of the FBI laboratory, at which time Special Agent Charles Killian advised that the laboratory had received, through Secret Service agent Richard Johnson, a bullet which had reportedly been found on a stretcher in the emergency room of Parkland Hospital, Dallas, Texas. This stretcher had also contained a stethoscope and a pair of rubber gloves. Agent Johnson had advised the laboratory that it had not been ascertained whether or not this was the stretcher which had been used to transport the body of President Kennedy. Agent Killian further described this bullet as pertaining to a 6.5 millimeter rifle, which could be approximately a .25 caliber rifle, and that this bullet consisted of a copper alloy full jacket. Immediately following receipt of this information, I made this available to Dr. Humes, who advised that, in his opinion, this accounted for no bullet being located, which had entered the back region, and that since external cardiac massage had been performed at Parkland Hospital, it was entirely possible that through such movement, the bullet had worked its way back out of the point of entry and had fallen onto the stretcher. Also, during the latter stages of the autopsy, a piece of the skull measuring 10 by 6.5 centimeters was brought to Dr. Humes, who was instructed that this had been removed from the president's skull. Immediately, this section of skull was x-rayed, at which time it was determined by Dr. Humes that one corner of this section revealed minute medical particles. An inspection of this same area disclosed a chipping of the top portion of this piece, both of which indicated that this had been the point of exit of the bullet entering the skull region. On the basis of the latter 2 developments, Dr. Humes stated that the pattern was clear, that the one bullet had entered the president's back and had worked its way out of the body during external cardiac massage, and that a second high-velocity bullet had entered the rear of the skull and had fragmentized prior to exit through the top of the skull. He further pointed out that X-rays had disclosed numerous fractures in the cranial area, which he attributed to the force generated by the impact of the bullet in its passage through the brain area. He attributed the death of the president to a gunshot wound in the head. The following is a complete listing of the photographs and x-rays taken by the medical authorities of the president's body. They were turned over to Mr. Roy Kellerman of the Secret Service. X-rays were developed by the hospital. However, the photographs were delivered to the Secret Service undeveloped. 11 X-rays, 22 4x5 color photographs, 18 4x5 black and white photographs, one roll of 120 film containing 5 exposures. Mr. Kellerman stated these items could be made available to the FBI upon request. The portion of the skull measuring 10 by 6.5 centimeters was maintained in the custody of Dr. Humes, who stated that it also could be made available for further examination. The 2 metal fragments removed from the brain area were hand-carried by Special Agents Siebert and O'Neill to the FBI laboratory immediately following the autopsy and were turned over to Special Agent Kurt Frazier. As I mentioned in the prologue, it's worth emphasizing some of the points that were in the Siebert and O'Neill report, even though the report itself is simply written and easy to evaluate on its own. So at the risk of being redundant, which many of you know I am going to do just that. First, it's clear that the objective of the autopsy was to retrieve bullets, and I emphasize the term bullets, plural, rather than singular, whether that is splitting a fine point for no reason. Well, I'm not sure. But the point is, the stated principal objective of the autopsy was to recover bullets. Bullets that presumably could be connected. Connected to what? Well, although it was not directly stated, connected to the Mannlicher Carcano rifle. Supposedly Oswald's rifle. The plural reference at the outset of the autopsy is interesting, since they were unaware at the outset of the autopsy that a second bullet had hit the president in the back. That was discovered during the course of the autopsy. Since this report was written after the autopsy was completed and evidence of at least 2 bullets was actually found during the autopsy, the writing style used by Siebert and O'Neill may have just simply adopted the plural instead of the singular. Oh well, I'll just let that dog lie. The report explicitly says that the ambulance was driven around from the front after the dropping off of Jackie and Robert, and then driven right around to the back to the morgue. This fact is important as we understand the chain of custody of the bronze casket. A related part of the report that has become a bit of a controversial topic relates to the statement in the report where they indicate that a tight security was immediately placed around the autopsy room. That security was never discussed in detail within the report, and in later years it did come under some scrutiny by David Lifton. Difficult for me to understand the impact of this, but for those who read Lifton's discussion, you will get how this fits into his narrative around how surgery on the body could have happened. The report emphasizes that besides the inventory of Secret Service and FBI agents, only medical personnel of some sort were in attendance. We know that from an earlier episode. There are some misspellings in the report. For instance, you may have heard me say Gerald Crester, when proper spelling is Gerald Custer, for example. The report indicates that General Philip Wheel did enter the room once. You remember Wheel from a previous episode, and his aide-de-camp Robert Lipsey. According to the report, Wheel entered simply to discuss arrangements to transport the president's body back to the White House after the autopsy. But interestingly, as we have already noted, no mention at all in the report of the presence of Robert Lipsey in the room. Quite a contrary discussion from Lipsey's story where he himself tells of his own involvement. And he swore to it under oath. The report confirms the existence of Mr. Chester, who was there to provide receipts of items given to the Secret Service and the FBI, and that he did, both for the bullet fragments that were removed and the undeveloped photographic film. That is, the pictures of the autopsy that were taken, and not seen, by the way, by the autopsy participants at that time. The report confirms the taking of x-rays at the outset of the autopsy, and they are also very explicit that all non-medical attendees were asked to leave the room while the x-rays and autopsy photos were being taken. The report confirms that the actual autopsy itself started around 8:15, affixing and confirming that there was a good 90 minutes or so between when the body arrived on site at Bethesda and when the actual autopsy officially got underway. The report discusses the reveal of the president as he is removed from the casket, confirming that the body was wrapped in 2 sheets, one of those sheets wrapped around his head and covered with blood. And the significance of this is that the president was not described as being in a body bag. He was described as being wrapped consistent with how personnel at Parkland said they wrapped him before he left the hospital. Again, this point is important when we explore the concept of whether or not the president actually arrived in a shipping casket and not the bronze casket. The report notes the existence of a tracheotomy wound. How they determined it was that, whether it was ID'd immediately by the pathologist as such, was not indicated. But between the two, that is, Siebert and O'Neill, they had elementary anatomical training, which helped as they witnessed the autopsy. They knew the basic science and technique around what they were listening to and watching, and maybe they just understood that. They do not state that the pathologist identified this as such and stated that as such. The report also contains the famous surgery of the head comment, which is perhaps one of the most famous quotes in the document and the most controversial. It seems even more perplexing when you listen to the exact language used in the report. And I quote, "It was apparent that a tracheotomy had been performed as well as surgery of the head area, namely in the top of the skull." End quote. Well, that is pretty specific. Surgery in the top of the skull? So, years later, Siebert would try to explain away this comment, saying that the head surgery comment was really related to the tracheotomy comment, all sort of in one sentence. But honestly, from the language in the report, it's pretty clear that the surgery to the head comment is totally unrelated to the comment about the tracheotomy. So really, what did they mean at that moment? That there was surgery to the head as the body was revealed? It really does seem like there is a need for a better explanation than Siebert's explanation that he gave in later years, even though he and O'Neill are the only ones who truly knew what they meant when they originally wrote this report. Next, the report says that the X-ray reports that were developed and returned to the autopsy room disclosed a path that did show the rear entrance of the bullet to the president's head. I think that's important. The report also confirmed that the X-rays shown at that time indicated a spray of fragments distributed through the president's brain on the right side of the brain. Actually, they use the term skull. The report also confirms that the largest bullet fragment appeared to be lodged behind the right frontal sinus, while the second largest was lodged in the rear of the head. The report also confirms the removal of 2 metal fragments during the work on the brain, one measuring 7 by 2 millimeters and the other measuring 1 by 3 millimeters, and that they were both placed in a jar with a black metal top and then marked for identification and then sent along their way to the FBI lab, actually personally hand-delivered by Siebert and O'Neill to Kurt Frazier. And as we know, the next step was to link those 2 fragments to the Mannlicher Carcano rifle. In one of the more important statements within the report documents that Humes would find the bullet hole in the president's back and place his finger in it and realize that it traversed only a short distance into his back. The quote is clear, and I quote, "The distance traveled by this missile was a short distance, inasmuch as the end of the opening could be felt with the finger." The report confirms that there were no whole bullets found during the autopsy, only fragments. Here is the quote again to reemphasize. Begin the quote. Inasmuch as no complete bullet of any size could be located in the brain area, and likewise no bullet could be located in the back or any other area of the body, as determined by total body x-rays and inspection revealing there was no point of exit, the individuals performing the autopsy were at a loss to explain why they could find no bullets. The report then confirmed that during the autopsy, the FBI lab had received the bullet that was found at Parkland on a stretcher. So this was all known during the course of the autopsy. And that the bullet was found with gloves and a stethoscope on the stretcher as well. But there was no confirmation that the stretcher was the one that President Kennedy was placed on. The report was clear about that. All of that was communicated to Siebert and O'Neill during the autopsy and then relayed immediately by them to Humes during the autopsy. This is the bullet that we now know as the pristine bullet, the magic bullet, which became Commission Exhibit 399. Only at that moment, the conclusions that they made that night in the autopsy room was that this is the bullet that worked its way out of the president's back. Interestingly, the report stated that Agent Johnson, who had possession of the magic bullet, had recognized it already as a 6.5 millimeter shell, exactly equal to the shell size of the Mannlicher Carcano rifle, implying that they realized, or at least stated almost immediately, that it was a match with the Italian rifle. And that was communicated rather quickly to the autopsy group that night. The report also confirms that Humes made a very explicit statement after he heard the statement on the discovery of the stretcher bullet. During the autopsy, he would say that, and I quote, in his opinion, this situation accounted for which bullet had entered the back region, and that since external cardiac massage had been performed at Parkland Hospital, it was entirely possible that through such movement, the bullet had worked its way back out of the point of entry and had fallen onto the stretcher. The report also acknowledges the skull fragment being delivered during the course of the autopsy and the work that Humes and the pathologist did to determine how that piece fit into the picture. As we know, it was actually more than one fragment. Based on what they found and what was delivered and what they pieced together, they were able to find and conclude on a point of exit in the head. And this led to the statement and the quote, and I quote, that a bullet had entered the rear of the president's skull and fragmentized prior to exit at the top of the skull. The statement would later prove to be somewhat controversial as it confirmed the entry wound lower in the back of the skull and exiting higher in the head. A contrary entry and exit path for a bullet that was traveling originally from high up in the school book depository at a 21-degree downward angle. All right, let's pause for a second. Wow, that's a lot. I just counted 22 different key facts we just went over. Maybe more. There is a whole lot packed into that report. Now that we are armed with that, let's sit back and digest it. And then in the next episode, we will listen to the autopsy report itself. That'll be a short exercise. Sadly, a short exercise. Thank you for listening to episode 68 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK, in the enduring secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 69. I owe all our regular listeners an apology because I did say that we were going to be publishing at least one more episode over this past weekend when you were all finishing up turkey if you were in the U.S. or just enjoying a nice weekend if you're outside of the U.S. And frankly, I am a little behind. My brother Dennis and his wife Lauren were visiting from South Florida, and my son was with us as well, and I just decided to take the time with family. I hope you did too. Dennis and I told some old stories, ones that we used to tell so often to one another. They never seem to get old when we are telling them amongst ourselves. I'm sure that everyone listening to us when we tell those stories just rolls their eyes. You know how that is. But really, the telling of stories is a rich tradition, and it's a tradition that is still alive all around the world, in so many places, including so many family gatherings like the one we had this weekend. And when we get into this season of the year, the holiday season, wherever you are, you may be getting together with family, getting together with friends, and rehashing moments of the past and being joyful about them. It's such an important part of living. We also played a new game. It was a domino game called Spinner. It's become the new favorite in the house, and it has replaced another domino game that we play called Mexican Train. Simple games, simple fun. Some happy moments come out of playing games, but it always seems to be difficult to find time to do that in our busy lives. But long holiday weekends work well for that. That, mixed with a lot of good college football and a lot of good food, made for a great weekend and a lot of love in our house. Thank you, Dennis and Lauren, for traveling all that way from South Florida to come see us and spend some time with us. And thank you to my son Austin as well for traveling from Pittsburgh. Well, now let's get back to the autopsy. We have published 5 episodes already on the autopsy, and this is part 6 today. And, as you know, it's just a simple look. Well, maybe it's better characterized as just a simple wander. A wander through the autopsy report. And for those of you who don't like things squeamish, I get it. Skipping part of this one won't hurt my feelings, and it may not help or hurt your understanding of the assassination case either. It's not a long episode, as I've said already. I think more importantly, it does represent an extension of something we talked about in one of the earlier autopsy episodes. Frankly, that the men who carried out the autopsy, while they were trained pathologists, were not forensic pathologists. And the report itself, what is written in it, and perhaps more importantly what is completely absent from it, is highly notable. It's technical, all right, and there's a lot of medical terms in there that, as a layperson, you may not understand, and you may have to look up, if you're so inclined, but likely not. But more importantly, it does very little to articulate concisely the information that would be helpful in a court of law or in just letting the evidence speak for itself in terms of precisely tracking back to the origin of the shots that killed the president. I'm not a pathologist, but I suspect it gets no more than a C- in a writing class for what should have been the deployment of an A+ project team. I don't mean to disparage anybody involved in this tragedy. These men were all thrust into action. They didn't volunteer to do so. It's sort of like crossing an intersection in a car and in an instant being involved in a car crash. No one asked for it, not the car that ran the red light, nor the car that was traveling appropriately through the intersection to begin with. Tragedy can occur in either of the cars. It doesn't matter which one initiated the transgression. These men would live with this controversy throughout the rest of their lives. This literally was their 15 minutes of fame, even though the autopsy lasted a little more than 3 hours. In the last episode, we chronicled what was in the Siebert and O'Neill report. Those FBI agents were pretty clear about what they saw and what was said and what conclusions were made that night by the doctors, right then, real time. You'll find much of those conclusions, meaning those that you have just heard in the Siebert and O'Neill report, completely missing from the autopsy report. Probably the most controversial absence is the absence of any conclusions around the idea that a bullet fell out of the president's back during cardiac massage. And that is what created the pristine bullet that ended up becoming Commission Exhibit 399. We now know that such a conclusion is exactly what was thought that night, and that it was likely to be the most logical explanation of where that bullet had come from, the bullet wound in the back. And that is just what was thought by the pathologist that night at the autopsy. A bullet that struck the president in the back and traversed a small way without hitting any bony tissues and then just stopped. That is certainly more consistent with the damage that Commission Exhibit 399 sustained. The minor damage to that bullet is believable when you think that it might have entered the president's back and simply did not penetrate a great length and did not hit anything bony that would have done real damage. But of course, if that were the case, then there is another question that needs to be answered. What explained, then, the bullet hole in the front of the president's neck? The Parkland doctors thought it was an entrance wound, and certainly, if what I just described is true, that the back wound was a missile that dislodged during cardiac massage and was subsequently found on the stretcher at Parkland, well, that makes the idea of it being an entrance wound that much more believable. The ramifications to that are obvious. That means that there was a shot from the front, and then that does mean a second shooter. But we then get into the other unexplained mysteries, if that were true. Where are the remains of that bullet if it indeed entered from the front? Shouldn't there have been another bullet found during the autopsy? Where is the bullet, then, that entered from the front? Well, according to all the official records, there was no other bullet. But like most things in this JFK assassination story, and you really couldn't make this stuff up, well, years later, an important and rather credible story surfaced about the discovery of another bullet. A whole bullet discovered and recovered during the autopsy. That would explain the front entrance wound, wouldn't it? Or at least give plausibility to the fact that somewhere on the president's body there had to have occurred another bullet wound. And yet there is only evidence of entry in those three spots we have already chronicled: in the upper back, in the front through the throat, and in the head. And we know that the bullet that entered the head simply fragmented into pieces. It's pretty clear that the bullet entering the rear end of the head did just that from looking at a study of the x-rays. So no, I am talking about perhaps a shot that came from the front and pierced the president's neck, and then just entered the soft tissues and stopped, or perhaps bounced around internally, coming to a rest somewhere in JFK's body, a place that allowed for it to be found easily enough by someone involved in the autopsy. You'll hear about that in the next episode as well, this additional bullet. But first, let's get the autopsy report details out of the way in this episode. As you know, there were really two autopsy reports that are given official sanction. The one that was filed and included within the Warren Commission report and dated November 24th, 1963, and then a supplemental report related to examination of the brain that was dated December 6th. There is incredible discussion around the notes and the report drafts and the like, and I am hesitating to go into any of that because it's just full of rabbit holes. More of that was done by Harold Weisberg in his classic book, Post-Mortem. David Lifton as well in Best Evidence, and many others too. Maybe we'll get a little bit of that later in the autopsy series. I haven't decided yet on whether we're going to wade into that water, and if we do, what exactly shall we include in the discussion? So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 69 of JFK, the enduring secret. The autopsy report and the supplemental report is contained in Commission Exhibit number 387. The front page of the autopsy report is stark. It's signed by Commander Humes and it's initialed by Boswell and Fink. It has but a few important facts. The height of the president was 72.5 inches, or 6 feet 1/2 inch. He weighed 170 pounds. His eyes were blue. His hair was reddish-brown. The cause of death is simply stated. Gunshot wound, head. Most forensic reports have some form of clinical summary and a bit of background. This one is no different, although the background seems to be more of a newspaper report than it does a forensic report. I'll read it to you. We'll start with a clinical summary. According to available information, the deceased, President John F. Kennedy, was riding in an open car in a motorcade during an official visit to Dallas, Texas on 22nd November 1963. The president was sitting in the right rear seat with Mrs. Kennedy seated on the same seat to his left. Sitting directly in front of the president was Governor John B. Conley of Texas, and directly in front of Mrs. Kennedy sat Mrs. Conley. The vehicle was moving at a slow rate of speed down an incline into an underpass that leads to a freeway route to the Dallas Trade Mart, where the president was to deliver an address. 3 shots were heard and the president fell forward bleeding from the head. Governor Conley was seriously wounded by the same gunfire. According to newspaper reports, for instance, the Washington Post on November 23, 1963, Bob Jackson, a Dallas Times-Herald photographer, said that he looked around as he heard the shots and saw a rifle barrel disappearing into a window on an upper floor of the nearby Texas School Book Depository building. Shortly following the wounding of the 2 men, the car was driven to Parkland Hospital in Dallas. In the emergency room of that hospital, the president was attended to by Dr. Malcolm Perry. Telephone communication with Dr. Perry on November 23, 1963, developed the following information relative to the observations made by Dr. Perry and procedures performed there prior to death. Dr. Perry noted that the massive wound of the head and a second much smaller wound of the low anterior neck is approximately the midline. A tracheotomy was performed by extending the latter wound. At this point, bloody air was noted bubbling from the wound, and an injury to the right lateral wall of the trachea was observed. Incisions were made in the upper anterior chest wall bilaterally to combat possible subcutaneous emphysema. Intravenous infusions of blood and saline were begun, and oxygen was administered. Despite these measures, cardiac arrest occurred, and closed chest cardiac massage failed to reestablish cardiac action. The president was pronounced dead approximately 30 to 40 minutes after receiving his wounds. The remains were transported via the presidential plane to Washington, D.C., and subsequently to the Naval Medical School, National Naval Medical Center, Bethesda, Maryland, for post-mortem examination. Next, we're going to cover a general description of the body. The body is that of a muscular, well-developed, and well-nourished adult Caucasian male measuring 72.5 inches and weighing approximately 170 pounds. There is beginning rigor mortis, minimal dependent livor mortis of the dorsum, and early algor mortis. The hair is reddish-brown and abundant. The eyes are blue. The right pupil measuring 8 millimeters in diameter, the left 4 millimeters. There is edema and ecchymosis of the inner canthus region of the left eyelid, measuring approximately 1.5 centimeters in greatest diameter. There is edema and ecchymosis diffusely over the right supraorbital ridge with abnormal mobility of the underlying bone. The remainder of the scalp will be described with the skull. There is clotted blood on the external ears, but otherwise the ears, the nares, and mouth are essentially unremarkable. The teeth are in excellent repair, and there is some pallor of the oral mucous membrane. Situated on the upper right posterior thorax, just above the upper border of the scapula, there is a 7 by 4 millimeter oval wound. This wound is measured to be 14 centimeters from the tip of the right acromion process and 14 centimeters below the tip of the right mastoid process. Situated in the low anterior neck at approximately the level of the third and fourth tracheal rings is a 6.5 centimeter long transverse wound with widely gaping irregular edges. The depth and character of these wounds will be further described below. Situated on the anterior chest wall and the nipple line are bilateral 2 centimeter long recent transverse surgical incisions into the subcutaneous tissue. The one on the left is situated 11 centimeters cephalad to the nipple, and the one on the right is 8 centimeters cephalad to the nipple. There is no hemorrhage or ecmosis associated with these wounds. A similar cleaned wound measuring 2 centimeters in length is situated on the anterolateral aspect of the left mid-arm. Situated on the anterolateral aspect of each ankle is a recent 2 centimeter transverse incision into the subcutaneous tissue. There is an old, well-healed 8 centimeter McBurney abdominal incision. Over the lumbar spine in the midline is an old, well-healed 15 centimeter scar. Situated on the upper anterolateral aspect of the right thigh is an old, well-healed 8 centimeter scar. Now let's proceed to a description of the missile wounds. Number 1, there is a large, irregular defect of the scalp and skull on the right, involving chiefly the parietal bone, but extending somewhat into the temporal and occipital regions. In this region, there is an actual absence of scalp and bone, producing a defect which measures approximately 13 centimeters in greatest diameter. From the irregular margins of the above scalp defect, tears extend in stellate fashion into the more or less intact scalp as follows. Item A. From the right inferior temporoparietal margin anterior to the right ear to a point slightly above the tragus. B. From the anterior parietal margin anteriorly on the forehead to approximately 4 centimeters above the right orbital ridge. C. From the left margin of the main defect across the midline anterolaterally for a distance of approximately 8 centimeters. D. From the same starting point at 10 centimeters posterolaterally. Situated in the posterior scalp, approximately 2.5 centimeters laterally to the right and slightly above the external occipital protuberance, is a lacerated wound measuring 15 by 6 centimeters. In the underlying bone is a corresponding wound through the skull, which exhibits beveling of the margins of the bone when viewed from the inner aspect of the skull. Clearly visible in the above described large skull defect and exuding from it is lacerated brain tissue, which on close inspection proves to represent the major portion of the right cerebral hemisphere. At this point, it is noted that the falx cerebri is extensively lacerated with disruption of the superior sagittal sinus. Upon reflecting the scalp, multiple complete fracture lines are seen to radiate from both the large defect at the vertex and the smaller wound at the occiput. These vary greatly in length and direction, the longest measuring approximately 19 centimeters. These result in the production of numerous fragments which vary in size from a few millimeters to 10 centimeters in greatest diameter. The complexity of these fractures and the fragments that produced text satisfactory verbal description and are better appreciated in photographs and röntgenograms, which are prepared. The brain is removed and preserved for further study following formalin fixation. Received as separate specimens from Dallas, Texas, are 3 fragments of skull bone, which in aggregate roughly approximate the dimensions of the large defect described above. At one angle of the largest of these fragments is a portion of the perimeter of a roughly circular wound, presumably of exit, which exhibits beveling of the outer aspect of the bone and is estimated to measure approximately 2.5 to 3.0 centimeters in diameter. Röntgenograms of this fragment reveal minute particles of metal in the bone at this margin. Röntgenograms of the skull reveal multiple minute metallic fragments along a line corresponding with a line joining the above described small occipital wound and the right supraorbital ridge. From the surface of the disrupted right cerebral cortex, 2 small, irregularly shaped fragments of metal are recovered. These measure 7 by 2 millimeters and 3 by 1 millimeters. These are placed in the custody of agents Francis X. O'Neill, Jr. and James W. Seibert of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who executed a receipt, therefore attached. The second wound, presumably of entry, is that described above in the upper right posterior thorax. Beneath the skin, there is ekmosis of subcutaneous tissue and musculature. The missile path through the fascias and musculature cannot be easily probed. The wound, presumably of exit, was that described by Dr. Malcolm Perry of Dallas in the low anterior cervical region. When observed by Dr. Perry, the wound measured, in quotes, a few millimeters in diameter, end quote. However, it was extended as a tracheotomy incision, and thus its character is distorted at the time of autopsy. However, there is considerable ekmosis of the strap muscles of the right side of the neck and of the fascia above the trachea adjacent to the line of the tracheotomy wound. The third point of reference in connecting these 2 wounds is the apex, that is, the supraclavicular portion of the right pleural cavity. In this region, there is contusion of the parietal pleura and of the extreme apical portion of the right upper lobe of the lung. In both instances, the diameter of contusion and ekmosis at the point of maximal involvement measures 5 centimeters. Both the visceral and parietal pleura are intact, overlying these areas of trauma. The next section covers incisions. The scalp wounds are extended in the coronal plane to examine the cranial content, and the customary shaped incisions is used to examine the body cavities. Thoracic cavity is next. The bony cage is unremarkable. The thoracic organs are in their normal positions and relationships, and there is no increase in free pleural fluid. The above described area of contusion is the apical portion of the right pleural cavity, is noted. The lungs. The lungs are of essentially similar appearance, the right weighing 320 grams, the left 290 grams. The lungs are well aerated with smooth, glistening pleural surfaces and gray-pink color. A 5 centimeter diameter area of purplish red discoloration and increased firmness to palpitation is situated in the apical portion of the right upper lobe. This corresponds to the similar area described in the overlying parietal pleura. Incision in this region reveals recent hemorrhage into pulmonary parenchyma. Next, we move to the heart. The pericardial cavity is smooth-walled and contains approximately 10 cc's of straw-colored fluid. The heart is of essentially normal external contour and weighs 350 grams. The pulmonary artery is opened in sight and no abnormalities are noted. The cardiac chambers contain moderate amounts of postmortem clotted blood. There are no gross abnormalities of the leaflets of any of the cardiac valves. The following are the circumferences of the cardiac valves: aortic 7.5 centimeters, pulmonic 7 centimeters, tricuspid 12 centimeters, mitral 11 centimeters. The myocardium is firm and reddish brown. The left ventricular myocardium averages 1.2 centimeters in thickness, the right ventricular myocardium 9.4. The coronary arteries are dissected and are of normal distribution and smooth-walled and elastic throughout. The abdominal cavity. The abdominal organs are in their normal positions and relationships, and there is no increase to free peritoneal fluid. Now we'll move to the abdominal cavity. The abdominal organs are in their normal positions and relationships, and there is no increase in free peritoneal fluid. The vermiform appendix is surgically absent, and there are a few adhesions joining the region of the cecum to the ventricle abdominal wall at the above described old abdominal incision scar. Next, we move to the skeletal system. Aside from the above described skull wounds, there are no significant gross skeletal abnormalities. Next, photography. Black and white and color photographs depicting significant findings are exposed, but not developed. These photographs were placed in the custody of Agent Roy Kellerman of the U.S. Secret Service, who executed a receipt, therefore attached. Next, we move to a section entitled Röntgenograms. Röntgenograms are made of the entire body and of the separately submitted 3 fragments of skull bone. They are developed and were placed in the custody of Agent Roy Kellerman of the U.S. Secret Service, who executed a receipt thereafter. Röntgenograms are made of the entire body and of the separately admitted 3 fragments of skull bone. They are developed and were placed in the custody of Agent Roy H. Kellerman of the U.S. Secret Service, who executed a receipt thereafter attached. Next, we move to the summary. Based on the above observations, it is our opinion that the deceased died as a result of 2 perforating gunshot wounds inflicted by high-velocity projectiles fired by a person or persons unknown. The projectiles were fired from a point behind and somewhat above the level of the deceased. The observations and available information do not permit a satisfactory estimate as to the sequence of the 2 wounds. The fatal missile entered the skull above and to the right of the external occipital protuberance. A portion of the projectile traversed the cranial cavity in a posterior to anterior direction. See the lateral skull Röntgenograms, depositing minute particles along its path. A portion of the projectile made its exit through the parietal bone on the right, carrying with it portions of cerebrum, skull, and scalp. The 2 wounds of the skull, combined with the force of the missile, produced extensive fragmentation of the skull, lacerations of the superior sagittal sinus, and of the right cerebral hemisphere. The other missile entered the right superior posterior thorax above the scapula and traversed the soft tissues of the suprascapular and the supraclavicular portions of the base of the right side of the neck. This missile produced contusions of the right apical parietal pleura and of the apical portion of the right upper lobe of the lung. The missile contused the strap muscles of the right side of the neck, damaged the trachea, and made its exit through the anterior surface of the neck. As far as can be ascertained, this missile struck no bony structures in its path through the body. In addition, it is our opinion that the wound of the skull produced such extensive damage to the brain as to preclude the possibility of the deceased surviving this injury. A supplementary report will be admitted following more detailed examination of the brain and of microscopic sections. However, it is not anticipated that these examinations will materially alter the findings. Signed, Commander Humes, Commander Boswell, and Lieutenant Colonel Fink. Now we move to the supplementary report of autopsy. We start with a gross description of the brain. Following formalin fixation, the brain weighs 1,500 grams. The right cerebral hemisphere is found to be markedly disrupted. There is a longitudinal laceration to the right hemisphere, which is parasagittal, in position approximately 2.5 centimeters to the right of the midline, which extends from the tip of the occipital lobe posteriorly to the tip of the frontal lobe anteriorly. The base of the laceration is situated approximately 4.5 centimeters below the vertex in the white matter. There is considerable loss of cortical substance above the base of the laceration, particularly in the parietal lobes. The margins of this laceration are, at all points, jagged and irregular, with additional lacerations extending in various directions and for varying distances from the main laceration. In addition, there is a laceration of the corpus callosum extending from the genu to the tail. Exposed in this latter lacerations are the interiors of the right lateral and third ventricular. When viewed from the vertex, the left cerebral hemisphere is intact. There is marked engorgement of meningeal blood vessels of the left temporal and frontal regions with considerable associated subarachnoid hemorrhage. The gyri and soli over the left hemisphere are of essentially normal size and distribution. Those on the right are too fragmented and distorted for satisfactory description. When viewed from the basilar aspect, the disruption of the right cortex is again obvious. There is longitudinal laceration of the midbrain through the floor of the third ventricle just behind the optic chiasm and the mammillary bodies. T, his laceration partially communicates with an oblique 1.5 centimeter tear through the left cerebral peduncle. There are irregular superficial lacerations over the basilar aspects of the left temporal and frontal lobes. In the interest of preserving the specimen, coronal sections are not made. The following sections are taken for microscopic examination. A, from the margin of the laceration in the right parietal lobe. B, from the margin of the laceration in the corpus callosum. C, from the anterior portion of the laceration in the right frontal lobe. D, from the contused left frontoparietal cortex. E, from the line of transaction of the spinal cord. F, from the right cerebellar cortex. G, from the superficial laceration of the basilar aspect of the left temporal lobe. During the course of this examination, 7 black and white and 6 color 4x5-inch negatives are exposed but not developed. The cassettes containing those negatives have been delivered by hand to Rear Admiral George W. Berkeley at the White House. Microscopic examination of the brain. Multiple sections from representative areas, as noted above, are examined. All sections are essentially similar and show extensive disruption of brain tissue with associated hemorrhage. In none of the sections examined are there significant abnormalities other than those directly related to the recent trauma. The heart sections show a moderate amount of subepicardial fat. The coronary arteries, myocardial fibers, and endocardium are unremarkable. Lungs Sections through the grossly described areas of contusion in the right upper lobe exhibit disruption of alveolar walls and recent hemorrhage into alveoli. Sections are otherwise essentially unremarkable. Liver. Sections show the normal hepatic architecture to be well preserved. The parenchymal calls exhibit markedly granular cryptoplasm, indicating high glycogen content, which is characteristic of the liver biopsy patterns of sudden death. The spleen. Sections show no significant abnormalities. Kidneys. Sections show no significant abnormalities aside from dilation and enlargement of blood vessels of all calibers. Skin wounds. Sections through the wounds in the occipital and upper right posterior thoracic regions are essentially similar. In each, there is a loss of continuity of the epidermis with coagulation necrosis of the tissues at the wound margins. The scalp wound exhibits several small fragments of bone at its margins in the subcutaneous tissue. This supplementary report covers in more detail the extensive degree of cerebral trauma in this case. However, neither this portion of the examination nor the microscopic examinations alter the previously submitted report or add significant details to the cause of death. Signed by Commander Humes and initialed by Boswell and Fink. Also included is a cover letter from the commanding officer of the U.S. Naval Medical School to the White House physician, and done via the commanding officer of the National Naval Medical Center. And that is the subject of the supplementary report. And it contains a subject line noting it's a supplementary report of Naval Medical School autopsy number A63-272 for John F. Kennedy. What's interesting is that it has only one item listed, stating that all copies of the above subject final supplementary report are forwarded herewith. Signed, J.H. Stover, Jr. And there is a first endorsement on December 6th from Commanding Officer, National Naval Medical Center, noting that it was forwarded from C.B. Galloway's office, or by C.B. Galloway. It's not clear because it contains no signature. Okay, that was really difficult to get through, and I am sure I mispronounced at least a dozen or more medical terms. I'm not a doctor. This stuff is not simple. Clearly, it's not a place for amateurs to wade into. Still, one thing is very clear about what we just heard. There is no clearly articulated discussion about the angle of the wounds and other relevant information confirming where the wounds were on the body. Basic stuff like comparing the bullet hole in his suit and his shirt to the spot on his body, so that later review of that evidence after the body was gone could reconfirm exactly where that bullet entered his body. I'm talking about common sense stuff, not all the highly technical aspects associated with this review. As you can tell, there are a number of things absent, as we said at the outset in the prologue. Well, I'm just going to leave it at that. You know, I really hesitated about reading an autopsy report for the President of the United States. And I totally understand the idea that some people listening to this podcast made a good decision to avoid listening to some of this. It's gruesome, and perhaps maybe not even in very good taste. But it's evidence, and it's evidence in the public realm, and it's evidence that would have been hotly debated had there been a trial, and had any one of us been a juror in that trial. Well, stay tuned, because what you're going to hear in episode 70 really starts to get into some important stuff. Some of the real fantastic parts of the story related to this autopsy. That extra bullet that was found, you'll hear about that next on episode 70. Some of the issues around the casket, that's coming too. Whether he arrived really truly in that bronze casket or whether he was in a shipping casket, you'll hear that too. Those are next. This is getting better by the minute, isn't it? Thank you for listening to episode 69 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 70. I think I really do owe all of you listening an apology. That last episode, episode 69, was longer than I told you it would be, and it was tough to get through. I know it. Part of my zeal relates to providing a complete record of what I feel are some of the most important things related to this whole story. It's not that information such as the autopsy report doesn't already exist, and honestly, in many cases, it's much more well done and more well researched in some books than I could ever do justice to it. But there's some things that must just end up in the record. I was adamant about that, and that was the case when it came to the autopsy report. What was missing was the usual analysis on my end about what all that meant. We got to 40 minutes in the episode, and I was coming to the conclusion that there was just no more time to go any further, at least not in episode 69. Let's face it, it wasn't my best episode. You know what? When I was a kid, about maybe 9 years old, I was just beginning to be introduced to pro football and what would become my childhood favorite pro football team, the Miami Dolphins. Back in 1970, Don Shula came to town to coach them, and he turned a team that was, I believe, 4-10 the year before in 1969, a relatively new expansion franchise in Miami, into a team that was 10-4 that year in 1970. And they made the playoffs for the first time in franchise history. Unfortunately, on a muddy field in Oakland, they lost in the playoffs that year. But it was a miraculous turnaround, and eventually it led to the perfect season, where they went 17-0 a few years later. Over the years, Don Shula would rack up enough wins to become the winningest coach in NFL history. And all of those wins that were racked up after 1970 were all with the Dolphins. I was hooked from the start of that journey. The Dolphins had a couple of outstanding seasons after that perfect season, and if it hadn't been for a crazy last-minute interception against the Oakland Raiders, again, they might have won 3 Super Bowls in a row, and not just 2. And they might have been in 4 Super Bowls in a row, and not just 3. Now, other teams over the years have had greater dynasties, the Steelers and the Patriots for sure. But the greatness of a perfect season in 72-73 was never achieved again by the Dolphins, and it has never been achieved since by any other team. There has never been a perfect season in the NFL before or since that date. What a moment. And what I experienced personally right then, I had never experienced before or since. It was enthralling, only I just couldn't have appreciated how good it was at that moment. Even though, even at that moment, it felt incredibly good. I think you all know what I mean. Soon, we will be coming on to the 50th anniversary of that record. Each year, when the last pro football team that's undefeated is finally chalking one up in the loss column, the Dolphin players that are still with us on this earth from that 72-73 undefeated season all get together and have a toast. They toast that undefeated team. They've been able to make that toast every year for the last 48 or 49 years. I think 50 will be especially sweet. Over the years, I have met many of those players from that team and that season. It was a very special time and a very special group of men. Sometimes things magical happen early in life, and then perhaps rather unfortunately, you come to expect that things will always happen that way. and then they don't. And you spend the whole rest of your life waiting for things magical to happen again, and they may never happen again. Football fans especially know that, whatever your brand of football is, but I suspect that most of us know that in our own lives in some way. You know the old saying, we may never pass this way again. Well, a long way from the football fields, there is a portion of a Shakespearean sonnet that quite often comes to mind for me, because I think it's so true about life. It goes like this. Most men lead lives of quiet desperation. Yeah, that goes for women too. I think it's just back then they only referred to the men. Well, that was a bit of a wander that had nothing to do with what I was talking about, but I think the original point here that I was trying to get across is that episode 69 wasn't my best episode. I'm not going to have a perfect season. If some episodes are a win and some are a loss, this last one probably wound up in the loss column. Or maybe it was a tie. It was not for everybody. It generated less consternation for the diehards who listen than the casual listener. But this season of JFK is more like a baseball season where you play 169 games. You can't be perfect. We have played 69 games so far. You can't be perfect. My challenge is to keep as many episodes as I can really good, and good enough most of the time, so I can keep you listening and tell the story the way I think it should be told. And sometimes a personal disappointment awakens you to much. It awakens you to what must be next. It sort of takes you to another place after your cheese has been moved. Remember that book, Who Moved My Cheese? As a side note, my cheese has been moved a lot in the last 5 years. For those of you who have listened to the podcast series as a whole, or if you know me personally, there are some out there that do, well, you know the bigger events anyway. It happens to everyone. Sooner or later, your cheese gets moved. To some, it just happens a lot. To some, it just happens a little. But to everyone, it just happens. All I can say is embrace the change. Most of the time I can. But today, and recently for me personally, it's been harder. Sometimes there is a moment when you wake up, so to speak. You finally get it. You have a moment of consciousness about the fact that your cheese really has been moved. It may have been moved for a while and you just didn't even know it. No one said it would be easy, but what I have found when things get tough, someone or something, sometimes it's simply your faith, always swoops in to help you find peace and find the patience and wisdom you need to get through the moment. I had a listener give me a blessing last week. In fact, I had several listeners in the past few weeks give me blessings. For those of you that I exchanged emails with related to the podcast, you know who you are, and I really appreciate the interaction. Each of you left me with something special. It was nourishment as I hunt for the cheese that has left the vicinity. I'll find that cheese again, but like most of us, I know I'll be a lonely hunter in the meantime. This podcast is a labor of love for me, but every once in a while, the reality of life just creeps in. I want to have a winning percentage, but I'm a realist too. I know it won't be a perfect season. The record will not be broken. Hats off to those 72-73 Dolphins. As a 9-year-old, they taught me much. They kept it up over the years, and I'm still learning from them 49 years later. Well, it's time to pivot from the lessons of life and get back to our story of the JFK assassination. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 70 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. The official story is that no intact bullets or even large bullet fragments were ever found during the course of the autopsy, and that's not all. In the official story, Dr. Humes, during the course of the autopsy, was by all official accounts, unaware of the fact that there was a gunshot wound that had pierced the president's neck. One that was either an entrance wound or an exit wound, one or the other. But either way, it was a real wound, and it was present in the anterior or front of the neck area. But it was now conveniently obliterated by the tracheotomy incision made at Parkland and not readily recognizable through observation by the time the president's body got to Bethesda. But nonetheless, the existence of that wound was known. In fact, it was known to millions of people by the time the autopsy began, which makes it so strange that the autopsy doctors themselves did not know of its existence. Surely someone in that group of 24 participants that night had seen the news that day. There is good reason to believe that both of these official assertions, the first, that Humes did not know at the time of the autopsy of the front wound to the neck, and the second, that there was no separate bullet recovered during the autopsy, are both false. First, Humes did indeed know, or became aware at some point during the autopsy, that in fact a bullet wound seen from the front by the Parkland doctors was present in the president's neck. We will get to how we know that. That is, how we know that Humes knew this during the autopsy. We'll get to that in just a second. And to top it off, there is good reason and evidence to believe that a fully intact bullet, along with other fragments, was removed that evening at the autopsy, even though it was missing from the official record. Why it was missing may have had more to do with how the intact bullet or the fragments were positioned. That is, whether or not the bullet or the fragments were found in such a position so as to indicate a possible shot that came from some direction that was, well, other than above and from behind. Keep in mind, at that moment, the moment of the autopsy, the complexities of firing time and the Mannlicher Carcano rifle imitations had not been revealed yet through study of the Zapruder film and the rifle itself. What had been known from the very start, from right after the shooting, is that the story was going to be about a lone gunman, about a one-gun, one-shooter story. It was a shooting from above and behind the president, and there was only one direction of shots, and all the evidence needed to support that thesis. And if there was contrary evidence, such evidence needed to be eliminated or ignored. So why are each of these two items, both so important? Why does it make the whole autopsy story, the story that is included in the official version of all this, quite dubious? Certainly, there is a longer list of potentially nefarious things related to the autopsy, but these two have fairly definitive evidence that the official version is false and that they are material to the conclusions. If you read the official account of things, Humes did not stumble upon the existence of the throat wound until well after the autopsy was over. As he recounts, in the wee hours of Saturday morning, apparently still grasping for answers, and certainly unstated, but perhaps it was because he was unsure about his conclusion from the night before, a conclusion that a bullet was forced out by cardiac massage, the bullet that Seibert and O'Neill informed Humes about during the autopsy and that had been recovered from a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. As the story goes, Dr. Humes had 2 telephone conversations with Malcolm Perry, the lead emergency room physician that took care of the president at Parkland. On the day of the assassination and the autopsy, Perry had made reference to a front, that is an anterior throat wound, 3 different times in the course of the post-mortem press conference at Parkland. The existence of that front or anterior wound to the neck was, by all accounts, all over the news, and on its way to millions of households as the interview was carried on television, radio, and also picked up by other news services, including UPI. To top it off, Dennis David was chief of the day for the Bethesda Naval Medical Center, and when events began to unfold, he too reported that he went into the office of the Master of Arms and he listened to the radio to get updates on what was happening as the assassination aftermath was unfolding. And guess who happened to walk in and listen to those radio accounts with him? Dr. J. Thornton Boswell. Boswell was one of the doctors that, within hours, would be performing the autopsy of the president. Dr. Pierre Fink, the third pathologist on the autopsy medical team that night, was not called to attend the autopsy until about 7:30 p.m. in the evening, and he was home with his wife at the time he received that call, watching accounts of what had been going on, according to statements he later made to the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA. Now, there is no definitive statement by either of these two gentlemen that they saw or heard anything on the news or heard anything from anyone else about the throat wound before they walked into the autopsy room, but it seems quite odd that they did not. Well, regardless, that's not proof that they knew, but before we talk about why we know that at least Humes knew, let's talk about why it's important. Most of the accounts of those two conversations between Dr. Humes and Dr. Perry have them taking place on Saturday morning in the wee hours after the autopsy. That official version of the story makes several things possible. First, it allows Humes to make the plausible assertion during the course of the autopsy that the shot which hit the president in the back could be accounted for by the bullet that was found on the Parkland stretcher, the one that Seibert and O'Neill told him about during the latter stages of the autopsy. Humes would reassert before the end of the autopsy that the bullet had probably just worked its way out of the president's body during external cardiac massage at Parkland. Without a current knowledge of the neck wound, there was no reason and no need for Dr. Humes during the course of the autopsy to definitively connect these two wounds. That was quite convenient for Dr. Humes and the rest of the autopsy team. Why, you say? Well, as we have already stated, the clinical critics say that any qualified forensic pathologist who was aware of the existence of that neck wound at the time of the autopsy, a wound that could have explained the traverse of the bullet from the president's back to the front and then out of his body through his neck, well, they would have performed a procedure called a section of the shoulder. Sectioning of the shoulder would have confirmed or denied the true trajectory and path of that bullet, if indeed there was one, and that would have been especially critical for the integrity of the autopsy, particularly in light of declaring that there was little depth to that hole in the president's back, that the bullet just penetrated and then just seemed to stop. The record shows that Humes probed that hole, and it was not deep, and it did not appear to have an exit path through the body. You see, if that shoulder had been sectioned, it would have been the only true way to link those two wounds. And the only way that could have been done is during the autopsy. And it could have determined if the bullet that entered the back had indeed taken a path of exit out of the front and through the bullet wound that was now obliterated by the tracheotomy incision. How convenient. On Saturday morning, it was now too late to perform any more autopsy procedures. On Saturday morning, after supposedly having the conversations with Dr. Perry, and only then did Dr. Humes connect the back wound with the front neck wound. Too late for any sectioning to confirm or deny that theory. At about this time, there was one more ancillary fact that began to morph as well, for it too was needed to make the connection. That was the reference to the wound as being in the back. That reference began to disappear. It now became an upper shoulder entry, because a back wound did not support a downward trajectory and exit through the neck. One thing was for sure, they were still solely trying to solve for a single gunman shooting from the top of the Texas School Book Depository. And so, the simple geometry of that shot angle was still being emphasized. A shot would have had to have entered higher in the back than where it exited on the front at a higher downward angle. if these two wounds were to be successfully linked together. A subtle change, those doctors thought, in language. A subtle change associated with how you describe the back wound. My, they were wrong. It was not subtle. Now, let's turn to the story of the undocumented bullet. First, why would finding a bullet during the course of the autopsy be problematic? I mean, the stated reason for the autopsy was to find the bullets and link those bullets to the gun that supposedly had been used by the accused assassin. Was this bullet I am about to describe found early during the autopsy and in a position on the body that would have indicated a shot from the front? Or at least not consistent with a shot coming from the depository? We simply don't know, but we know the whole bullet existed, and so did additional fragments. The theories about Oswald as a lone gunman were widely circulated by the start of the autopsy at about 8 o'clock that evening. And so if we know anything, we know one thing that had to come out of the autopsy, and that was that there was to be no contrary evidence of a shot from any angle or direction except for a shot from behind and above. We certainly know that at the moment of the autopsy, that the complications around the number of shots, as defined by the Zapruder film timing, and the limitations of shooting a Mannlicher Carcano rifle were not yet known, and so they were not yet under consideration by the Warren Commission staff. So that motivation at that moment was an unlikely consideration for those trying to control the autopsy, if that were in fact going on. That is an important fact for us as a jury to understand. It's easy to get drawn into all aspects of conspiracy theory, but the timing of these events is critical in understanding what the motivations may or may not have been at that moment. However, the idea of a shot coming from a contrary direction, that is, from some direction other than from the rear and higher up, if there was evidence of that anywhere on the president's body, that would have created a complication for what was already shoring up to be a tidy little story of a lone gunman theory, a nut who did it and acted alone doing it. With that as a backdrop, let's present the evidence. Regarding the idea that Humes knew about the anterior neck wound during the autopsy, there is no better credible evidence than the testimony of Dr. Robert Livingstone and the letters that he wrote. This is testimony of a witness that was directly involved that night in a conversation to inform Dr. Humes. It involves a highly credible witness at the highest levels of our government. A witness who is clinically competent, highly clinically competent. A witness that made repeated attempts in various venues after the assassination to set this record straight with high officials of our government and its then current administrations. But like so much that encompasses this case, he was simply ignored. Let's give you a little bit of background on Robert B. Livingstone, M.D. Like so many characters in this play, Livingstone had a prodigious and impressive background. He was also a well-connected man who ran in the high social circles of Washington and academia. He was a hiking buddy of Robert S. McNamara, who was President Kennedy's Secretary of Defense. Dr. Livingstone was about 45 years old at the time Kennedy was assassinated. He had studied at Stanford University, and he was graduated in 1940 before going on to obtain his M.D. degree from Stanford Medical School. During the Second World War, he served in the Pacific, and he took part in the invasion of Okinawa. He was a doctor and a naval officer. And as a naval officer, he earned the Bronze Star. During the war, he saw the destruction and suffering that took place as a result of the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs. It influenced him greatly. Later, and I am sure partly as a result of the influence of these events and the direction it took his life in, he would become socially active in the cause against nuclear proliferation, and he would earn a Nobel Peace Prize because of it. But first, in 1946, right after the war, he began work at the Yale University School of Medicine. He served on the faculty of the University of California, Los Angeles, from 1952 to 1960. And he had other teaching appointments at Stanford and Harvard, where he also taught pathology, anatomy, and psychiatry. In 1952, President Dwight Eisenhower appointed Livingston as the scientific director of the National Institute of Neurological Diseases and Blindness, as well as the National Institutes for Mental Health. And these were posts that he also held during the Kennedy administration. In 1964, Livingstone later founded the first ever Department of Neurosciences at UCSD. In the 1970s, Livingstone was instrumental in developing some of the first 3D images of the human brain. Later, he was awarded a major grant to develop a prototype computer system to map the brain in 3 dimensions in microscopic detail. Livingstone was active in several anti-nuclear weapons and peace organizations, including the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And in 1985, as I mentioned earlier, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. Livingstone, along with David Manick, Charles Crenshaw, Ronald F. White, and Jack White, contributed to Assassination Science. It's a book edited by James H. Fetzer. Much of this episode is drawn from the information contained in that book. Robert B. Livingstone died in 2002. I am going to share now excerpts from letters sent by Dr. Livingstone to David Lifton and also to the editor of Newsweek. They are revealing and self-explanatory and clearly support the fact that Dr. Humes knew about the frontal wound before completing the autopsy. So here we go. I will begin the reading of the letters now. This is the first letter to David Lifton, dated the 2nd of May, 1992. I learned from a former classmate of mine from Stanford who was then a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Richard Dudman, that he was one of the White House press group that accompanied the president to Dallas. Not getting much information from the Parkland Hospital, Dick went out to inspect the Lincoln limousine in which the president and Conley and their wives had been riding. He thought he saw for certain that there was a through-and-through hole in the upper left margin of the windshield. He described the spalling, splintering of glass at the margins as though the missile had entered from the front of the vehicle. When he reached over to pass his pencil or pen through the hole to test its patency, an FBI or Secret Service man roughly drew him away and shooed him off, instructing him that he wasn't allowed to come so close to that vehicle. If there were a through-and-through windshield penetration in that location, according to Dick, it had to come from in front. According to him, it would have been impossible to hit the windshield in that location from the overhead angle from the schoolbook depository, nor would a through-and-through penetration have been likely to be caused by a ricocheting bullet bouncing up from the rear. What is most relevant from my personal experience is that on that same evening before the president's body on Air Force One had arrived at Andrews Air Force Base, I telephoned the Bethesda Navy Hospital. I believe that the call was made before the plane arrived because I recollect that it was following that call that I watched Robert S. McNamara, and that is Bob McNamara, who is a long-standing, since 1952, mountain climbing and hiking companion of mine. I watched him receive the Kennedy entourage and the casket being lowered on a forklift from the rear of the Air Force One onto the field tarmac. Inasmuch as I was scientific director of 2 of the institutes at the NIH, and both institutes were pertinent to the matter of the president's assassination and brain injury, the Navy hospital operator and the officer on duty put me through to speak directly with Dr. Humes, who was waiting to perform the autopsy. After introductions, we began a pleasant conversation. He told me that he had not heard much about the reporting from Dallas and from the Parkland Hospital. I told him that the reason for making such an importuning call was to stress that the Parkland Hospital physician's examination of President Kennedy revealed what they reported to be a small wound in the neck, closely adjacent to and to the right of the trachea. I explained that I had knowledge from the literature on high-velocity wound ballistics research, in addition to considerable personal combat experience examining and repairing bullet and shrapnel wounds. I was confident that a small wound of that sort had to be a wound of entrance, and that if it were a wound of exit, it would almost certainly be widely blown out, with cruciate or otherwise wide tearing outward ruptures of the underlying tissues and skin. I stressed to Dr. Humes how important it was that the autopsy pathologists carefully examine the president's neck to characterize that particular wound and to distinguish it from the neighboring tracheotomy wound. I went on to presume further that the neck wound would probably not have anything to do with the main cause of death, massive disruptive brain injury, because of the angle of bullet trajectory and the generally upright position of the president's body, sitting up in the limousine. Yet, I said carefully, if that wound were confirmed as a wound of entry, it would prove beyond peradventure of doubt that that shot had been fired from in front. Hence, that if there were shots from behind, there had to have been more than one gunman. Just at that moment, there was an interruption in our conversation. Dr. Humes returned after a pause of a few seconds to say that, in quotes, the FBI will not let me talk any further, end quote. I wished him good luck, and the conversation was ended. My wife can be good witness to that conversation because we shared our mutual distress over the terrible events, and she shared with me my considerations weighing the decision to call over to the Bethesda Navy Hospital. The call originated in the kitchen of our home on Burning Tree Road in Bethesda, with her being present throughout. After the telephone call, I exclaimed to her my dismay over the abrupt termination of my conversation with Dr. Humes through the intervention of the FBI. I wondered aloud why they would want to interfere with a discussion between physicians relative to the problem of how best to investigate and interpret the autopsy. Now, with knowledge of the apparently prompt and massive control of information that was imposed on assignment of responsibility for the assassination of President Kennedy, I can appreciate that the interruption may have been far more pointed than I had presumed at the time. I conclude, therefore, on the basis of personal experience, that Dr. Humes did have his attention drawn to the specifics and significance of President Kennedy's neck wound prior to his beginning the autopsy. His testimony that he only learned about the neck wound on the day after completion of the autopsy, after he had communicated with Dr. Perry in Dallas by telephone, means that he either forgot what I told him, although he appeared to be interested and attentive at the time, or that the autopsy was already under explicit non-medical control. That event, coupled with Dick Dudman's report to me around the same time of what appeared to him to be a penetrating hole through the Lincoln windshield, seems to me to add 2 grains of confirming evidence to the conspiracy interpretation. Incidentally, sometime later, I learned that the Secret Service had ordered from the Ford Motor Company a number of identical Lincoln limousine windshields for target practice. It seems to me that they might have wanted to learn how much protection could be expected from such a windshield. Alternatively, they might have wanted to produce an inside nick in a windshield without through-and-through penetration, so that they could substitute that nicked windshield for the other one, if it were needed for corroborative evidence relating to the Warren Commission's investigative interpretation and thesis. Wow, let's pause there. That's the end of the first letter. Livingstone wrote a second letter to Maynard Parker, who was editor then of Newsweek. It was dated the 10th of September, 1993, and it was after the first letter that went to David Lifton. Here it goes. I was scientific director of the National Institute for Mental Health and, concurrently, of the National Institute of Neurological Diseases and Blindness at the time of the assassination. These 2 institutes are obviously relevant to interpretations of brain damage sustained by the president. On the basis of November 22, 1963 broadcasts from Parkland Hospital, I felt obliged to call Commander James Humes at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, who was about to perform the autopsy. Our telephone conversation was completed before the body arrived at Andrews Air Force Base. I called to relay media reports from Parkland Hospital that there was a small wound in the front of his neck, just to the right of his trachea. Humes said he hadn't been paying attention to the news, but was receptive to what I had to tell him. We had a cordial conversation about this. Based on my knowledge of medical and experimental analyses of bullet wounding and personal experiences caring for numerous bullet and shrapnel wounds throughout the Battle of Okinawa, I told him that a small wound, as described, would have to be a wound of entry. When a bullet exits from flesh, it violently blows out a lot of tissue, usually making a conspicuous cruciate opening with tissue protruding. A wound of entry, however, just punctures as it penetrates. So I stressed the need for him to probe that wound to trace its course fully and to find the location of the bullet or fragments. I especially emphasized that such a wound had to be an entry wound. And since the president was facing forward the whole time, that meant that there had to be a conspiracy. As we talked about that, he interrupted the conversation momentarily. He came back on the line to say, "I'm sorry, Dr. Livingstone, but the FBI won't let me talk any longer." Thus, the conversation ended. Two important subsequent events are noteworthy. Commander Humes did not dissect that wound, and when asked why not, in the Warren Commission hearings, he said that he didn't know about the small wound in the neck until the following day, when he had a conversation with Dr. Perry at Parkland Hospital. A further issue concerns reports of the appearance of cerebellar tissue in the occipital wound. This was first reported live as observations by an orderly and by a nurse, both of whom were in the surgery where attempts to resuscitate the president were conducted prior to his death. I didn't give any credibility to those stories and dismissed them from my focus at the time, attributing what I thought must be mistaken identification of cerebellum to a likely lack of familiarity with neuroanatomy by two non-medically trained individuals. It would be easy to assume cerebellum in looking at macerated cerebral tissue protruding from a bloody wound. But since then, around 6 reputable physicians who saw the president at that time have testified that cerebellum was extruding from the wound at the back of his head. That is an important clue indicating that something must have burst into the posterior fossa with sufficient force to uproot the cerebellum and blow a substantial hole through the heavy covering, well-anchored tentorium, which separates cerebellum from the main chamber of the skull. Well, there you have it. If I were going to pick a witness to put in front of you on this topic, well, there you go. What more could I ask for, especially if I was an autopsy conspiracy theorist? And remember, the problem with this part of a cover-up is that it comes down to one thing. There were only government officials involved in this episode. That is what makes this part of the cover-up really scary. Even if it was done with the noble cause of avoiding a nuclear showdown. It's a tough one to swallow if you want to believe the lone gunman, lone nut theory. Well, how is that for an ending? You really can't write this stuff. Again, this is the story of the JFK assassination where truth really is stranger than fiction. It's been an extremely long episode, longer than I like, and now I'm hungry. So you know what's coming up. Yep. I need to go get a sandwich. And so I'll pause right there and leave the story of the intact bullet for episode 71. But you won't have to wait long. In fact, if you take a look, it's out now too. Thank you for listening to episode 70 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 71. One of the more curious stories related to the autopsy is the discovery of an intact bullet during the autopsy proceedings. It was never documented as part of the autopsy materials. The official autopsy indicates that no intact bullets were recovered at Bethesda. Whether it was a separate bullet, separate from Commission Exhibit 399, or whether it was actually Commission Exhibit 399, was a thesis explored by JFK assassination researcher David Lifton. Whether this is the bullet that was found on a stretcher in Dallas, or whether it fell out of the casket during the autopsy at Bethesda, may just be academic. That is, if there was just one bullet and it was the same bullet. In my mind, anyway, it doesn't make much difference where you found it. And those two choices don't seem to add much or detract much from the story. And it was important that there just be one intact bullet. It really did fit into the story nicely. Maybe the way someone in authority wanted the story to be told. At that moment, remember, they had 3 spent cartridges recovered from the 6th floor of the schoolbook depository, and they were aware of the fact that a shot had hit the curb and would have to be accounted for. Where it gets interesting for me is whether or not this was perhaps a second intact bullet that was in addition to the magic bullet found at Parkland, a bullet that we all know well. If there were 2 bullets, 2 intact bullets, and we also know the headshot produced bullet fragments from another bullet, which would account for a 3rd bullet, well then, let's all think back and recall one more shot, the one which we know nicked the sidewalk and caused a minor injury to James Tay. If this intact bullet found at Bethesda were a second intact bullet, then that would mean a total of 4 bullets had to have existed in the shooting sequence. And of course, that would confirm what everyone suspects, that there were too many shots fired too quickly for them all to have come from the one Mannlicher Carcano rifle. This is not a new concept. We've talked about it a lot in previous episodes, and certainly way back when we covered the Zapruder film. This is just one more avenue that points potentially to at least 4 shots having been fired. And believe me, there are other avenues that lead to that same conclusion. But what's interesting about this story is the basic irreconcilable differences on such a simple fact. Irreconcilable differences between highly credible people regarding their recollection of this bullet at the autopsy that night. You'll hear the details of that when we tell the story. This is not something you forget. Yet officials who were in attendance at the autopsy that night don't have the same recollection. We are talking about assertions made by Admiral Osborne and also Commander Humes. We're not talking about an orderly, not a nurse, not an x-ray tech. We are talking about the story given by an admiral. Now, one can lie or tell the truth whether you are an x-ray tech or an admiral, of course. But this story is so amazing because you would never think that an admiral would make something like this up. And I don't think he did. In fairness, he was a captain at the time. I'm just saying. And of course, it's not the only irreconcilable difference in the story of the autopsy. In fact, this is one part of the JFK assassination story that is replete with irreconcilable differences. This story itself is well researched by David Lifton, and it's documented in his best-selling book, Best Evidence. And really, the best way, I think, to tell this story is simply to read Chapter 29 of Best Evidence. It's entitled, The Assertion of Admiral David P. Osborne. This chapter gives a concise and interesting story tell of the whole affair, and it does so from Lifton's perspective regarding whether this intact bullet was really the one that purportedly was found at Parkland and became Commission Exhibit 399. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 71 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. This is chapter 29 of Best Evidence, entitled The Assertion of Admiral David P. Osborne. Please note that this is written in the first person by David Lifton himself. In May 1975, after 34 years of service, Rear Admiral David P. Osborne retired from the U.S. Navy as Deputy Surgeon General. On November 22, 1963, Dr. Osborne held the rank of captain and was chief of surgery at Bethesda Naval Hospital. The House Select Committee reported Osborne's assertion that he thought he recalled seeing an intact slug roll out from the clothing of President Kennedy and onto the autopsy table at the outset of the autopsy. The committee rejected this because no one else recalled anything about the discovery of a missile. The committee also noted that the president's body was unclothed at the outset of the autopsy. They reported that Admiral Osborne had been recontacted, advised of these objections, and then said that he could not be sure he actually did see a missile. I telephoned Admiral Osborne in October 1979, and after receiving a letter from my publisher, he agreed to speak with me. He came to the morgue that night because he was an old friend of Hume's, whom he referred to as Jim. Admiral Osborne told me that when he arrived at the morgue, the casket had not yet been opened. It was a very elaborate casket, he told me, as one might expect. It had not yet been opened, he said, and in fact, Hume's was insistent that the casket not be opened until everyone had arrived. We were all standing there, Osborne told me. There was quite a delay because the casket was opened, actually, because they were waiting for everyone to arrive that Jim wanted to be there. Everyone included Dr. Pierre Fink. Jim didn't wait to start until Colonel Fink got there. Admiral Osborne told me that the delay lasted at least 15, 20, 30 minutes, something in that neighborhood. There were other men present, he said, urging that everything be rushed and done as quickly as possible and get it over with. Jim was insisting that he wanted to get additional help. At some point, it is not clear from Fink's testimony whether it was before he had arrived, but the casket was opened. And it was then, according to Osborne, that a reasonably clean, unmarred bullet fell from the clothing that he said was around the body. The bullet was not deformed in any way, Osborne told me. He said that he and the committee had gotten into a disagreement. Not really a disagreement, but I told them that this was the way I remembered it, and they said, well, it must be wrong. Because the Secret Service testified that the bullet was found in the hospital at Parkland and brought back to Washington. And so I said, well, if that's true, then they brought it to the morgue because I had the bullet in my hand and looked at it. I was startled to hear Osborne say he held the bullet. The committee reported only that he thought he recalled seeing the slug. You had the bullet in your hand? I asked. That's right, he replied. You actually held it, Admiral. That's right, he said again. Did you tell the committee that? Yes, he said. When I asked Osborne if the bullet had any blood on it, he replied, no, it was reasonably clean. Was bullet 399 at Bethesda? There is a clear chain of possession on bullet 399, the only intact bullet in this case. A chain of possession from Parkland Hospital to the FBI laboratory. It traveled from Dallas to Washington in the pocket of Secret Service agent Richard Johnson of the White House detail. At 7:30 p.m., Johnson gave the bullet to Secret Service Chief Rowley at the Executive Office building. At 8:50, Rowley sent it to the FBI laboratory. The bullet was not at Bethesda. At least it was not supposed to be. If, however, it was, that would mean that no decision had yet been made as to where the bullet would be found. In any event, Osborne's impression that the bullet might have come from Parkland Hospital was not a legitimate explanation for its presence at Bethesda. Osborne and I discussed the matter further. "Who else held the bullet in their hands besides you, by the way?" I asked. "Do you remember?" "Several people had it," said Osborne. "I know the Secret Service had it." "Have you ever talked to Humes about the question of whether he had a bullet there, a whole bullet, that night?" "No. I tried to call Jim after you called me, but he's been out of town. I haven't been able to get a hold of him. I wanted to talk to him before I talked to you." I now read to Admiral Osborne the paragraph in the report in which his assertion was rejected, where it was passed off as something which he thought he recalled seeing. Osborne replied, "Well, as far as I am concerned, that's a lot of malarkey, because there was a bullet there and it was totally intact. What happened to it, I don't know, but the Secret Service took it. Let me call Jim Humes when I can catch him and talk to him about it and see what I can jog out of his memory and see why there is this discrepancy before we go on." Later, I came back to the matter again. Osborne again said he would be sure to contact Humes on it to resolve the matter, because I just can't see any reason for it, and I don't understand it. Still, later, I returned to the matter again, pointing out to him the seriousness of the assertion that the bullet in question never became evidence. "Well, the bullet existed," he replied. "I'm sure of that. The only concession I made to the committee when they called me was the fact that they had led me to believe that the FBI or Secret Service had carried that bullet back and deposited it somewhere in the headquarters or something or other, and that it didn't fall out of the clothing at Bethesda. And I told them on the phone that I wouldn't argue that point too much as to whether they'd carried it back or whether it fell out of the clothing. As I remembered it, it fell out of the clothing. But I know that it was there because I saw it. It fell out on the table, and I think everybody spotted it. All of us were right there. We spotted it at the same time, essentially. As soon as I could, I telephoned Humes and apparently reached him before Admiral Osborne did. He apparently did not know that Osborne had been interviewed by the committee. When I told him of the basic allegations, Humes replied, "I don't know where he got that. You mystify me with that story." Dr. Humes told me that Dr. Osborne was a super nice guy. I asked him how long they had known each other. "Dr. Osborne and I have been friends for 25 years, said Humes. The conflict was so irreconcilable that I was forced to ask Humes. I was curious whether he, that is Osborne, is getting on in years. Humes interjected, "No, he's a very bright, intelligent man. I don't know what he's talking about." But then Humes made a remark that I found rather curious. It was almost a concession. He said, "Well, they found a bullet in Dallas, and whether they brought it there to Bethesda or not, I can't tell you. I don't even remember that. I don't know. It was not my problem at that point." Then Humes said, "Certainly no bullet came with the wrappings of the president." And I wondered, what did Humes mean by wrappings? The sheet that was there when the body came in? Or the clothing that Osborne insisted that he saw? Did someone change the wrappings? Following these conversations, I reviewed the Osborne assertion from the standpoint of the record. The FBI receipt was dated November 22nd, 1963. It was issued by Seibert and O'Neill to Captain J.H. Stover, who was Humes' superior. Its exact wording was, "We hereby acknowledge receipt of a missile removed by Commander James J. Humes, MC, USN, on this date." This receipt apparently remained in Admiral Berkeley's possession until November 26th, 1963. On that date, Berkeley gave the receipt for a missile, along with the autopsy report and other related paperwork, i.e. a copy of the Navy order not to talk, the receipt for film holders, the receipt for surgical drapes and shroud. He gave them to Agent Robert Bauch, head of the Protective Research Section of the Secret Service. Upon receipt of these items, Bauch issued a receipt to Admiral Berkeley on Treasury Department letterhead. The seventh item on this Bauch receipt was the FBI receipt, listed as one receipt from FBI for a missile recovered during the examination of the body. Inexplicably, Bauch never gave the Warren Commission the FBI receipt itself, and despite the existence of the Bauch receipt in the Commission files, an official Treasury Department document alluding to an FBI receipt for a missile, there is no indication the Commission ever took notice of that or investigated the matter. The critics first learned of the FBI receipt when Bauch's receipt, which was an unpublished Warren Commission document, came to light in 1966. In 1969, after critic Harold Weisberg threatened to go to court to sue the Secret Service under the Freedom of Information Act for the items of evidence listed on Bauch's receipt that were not at the National Archives, the Secret Service turned over a file of documents to the archives, and the FBI receipt for a, quote, a missile was among them. Subsequently, when I questioned the FBI about the receipt, they took the position that the receipt was for the two tiny fragments Hume said he had removed from the brain, that was the only metal Seibert and O'Neill brought back to the FBI laboratory. Curiously, in the autopsy report, Humes referred to the two tiny fragments, saying, "These are placed in the custody of Agents Francis X. O'Neill, Jr. and James W. Seibert, who executed a receipt, therefore attached." But actually, no receipt was attached. There is evidence indicating that at some point the authorities may have had an informal conference of sorts to decide how to explain this receipt, which reached the National Archives in 1969. My correspondence with the FBI about the receipt occurred in 1970, and at that time I attached to my letter a copy of the Bauch receipt I obtained from the National Archives. I drew in a small arrow pointing to the seventh item on the Bauch receipt. The FBI assigned a file number to my correspondence. Years later, I directed a request under the Freedom of Information Act to the Secret Service for the original Secret Service copy of the Bauch receipt. I had been told by a staff member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence that the Secret Service files were in disorder and that certain items were missing. Shortly thereafter, I received from the Secret Service what purports to be their official copy of the Bauch receipt. Immediately, I noted something appeared odd because although the document was originally in the possession of the Secret Service and although my request was directed to the Secret Service, the document I received had in the lower right-hand corner an FBI file number. I requested Robert Reiner, a researcher in Washington, to go to the FBI files and find out what FBI file number was on that Bauch receipt. In other words, I wanted to know why the Secret Service was issuing a document which apparently came from the FBI file. Reiner excitedly called back to inform me that the FBI file number was the one assigned to my correspondence. In short, what the Secret Service now had in its files as the supposedly official copy of the Bauch receipt came from my files. It is a Secret Service copy of an FBI copy of my copy of an archives copy. What does all this mean? Well, until Admiral Osborne's statement, then, the record shaped up as follows. First, there was, on the one hand, a receipt for a missile, but no missile in evidence corresponding to that receipt. Second, there was a jar containing two tiny metal fragments but no receipt that seemed applicable to that jar. Yet the FBI stated in their own report that they had executed a proper receipt for those 2 fragments. Therefore, until the Osborne assertion, the natural conclusion was that the receipt for the 2 fragments was simply worded badly. The Osborne assertion cast everything in a new light. It raised the possibility that there was an incident at the outset of the Bethesda autopsy, or at least at a coffin opening which was witnessed by Admiral Osborne, at which a bullet, which looked like bullet 399, fell from the vicinity of the body. I now realize that if Admiral Osborne was correct, if he saw this bullet and held it in his hand, that did not necessarily mean that the bullet was brought back to the FBI laboratory. Indeed, Osborne was firm on who had the bullet. "I know the Secret Service had it," he told me. Did they keep it? Osborne's account raised the possibility that the bullet existed, that it was at Bethesda, that the FBI typed a receipt for it, but that the missile was not surrendered to the FBI. That Secret Service agents brought it back to Secret Service headquarters, where it was turned into the FBI laboratory as a bullet which was found on a Dallas stretcher. Such an incident, if it occurred, would be a major irregularity in the handling of this item of evidence. It suggested to me a last-minute change in the role the intact bullet was to play in this affair, i.e., where it was supposed to have originated. Certainly, that was supported by the post-midnight call to Daryl Tomlinson in Dallas, telling him not to discuss the bullet. Daryl Tomlinson was the Parkland employee who actually discovered the bullet. Because neither Humes nor Boswell ever spoke of such an incident, Osborne's assertion required corroboration. I was most surprised to discover corroboration in the report filed by FBI agents Seibert and O'Neill of their questioning of Secret Service agent Gerald Benn, the special agent in charge of the White House detail. The Seibert and O'Neill interview of Gerald Benn on November 27, 1963 was extraordinary because it appears that the 2 agents were questioning Benn about 3 matters pertaining to the autopsy, all dealing with how evidence reached the mainstream of the investigation. The first question was not listed, but the answer had to do with Air Force 2 passing Air Force 1 in flight. My conclusion was that the first question probably was, why was the body there before we were? The second question was listed. Mr. Benn was questioned concerning the section of the president's skull which was brought to the National Navy Medical Center at Bethesda, Maryland, after the autopsy was in progress. On Friday night, according to the telegram they sent at 2:00 a.m., Seibert and O'Neill had apparently been told the bone was flown in from Dallas Hospital. On November 27, 1963, Ben told them it was found in the car. And the third question, considered in the light of the Osborne assertion, now made sense. Ben was likewise questioned concerning the location of a bullet which had been found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, and which had been turned over by the Secret Service to an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation for delivery to the FBI laboratory. Seibert and O'Neill's wording was precise. They were not questioning Ben about which stretcher the bullet was found on in Dallas. They were questioning him on the bullet's location. I believe they must have asked, what was a bullet which we were subsequently told originated on a Dallas stretcher doing at the Bethesda morgue? In view of Osborne's account, the receipt issued by Seibert and O'Neill, which matched the bullet but not the fragments, and Seibert and O'Neill's questioning of Gerald Benn about the location of the bullet, it seemed reasonable to believe that the incident reported by Admiral Osborne did in fact occur. The bullet must have been at Bethesda, and the Secret Service probably took possession of it, explaining to Seibert and O'Neill that the missile had been found in Dallas and would be delivered to the FBI laboratory. Since the receipt in question was issued to Captain John Stover, the commanding officer of the U.S. Naval Medical School and Hume's immediate superior, in April 1980, I contacted Stover. I went directly to the point and told him about Osborne's allegation, the committee's position, and Osborne's insistence that he saw the bullet in the room. Indeed, that he held it in his hand. Stover confirmed the bullet was in the Bethesda morgue. It seems to me that the one they found in Dallas they brought up. I think it was in a brown paper envelope. Stover said he was unaware that Osborne had held the bullet. Stover said he himself had not. He said he associated the bullet with a brown paper envelope, one of those slim ones with the opening across the narrow end. I asked Stover about the receipt he signed. He said, "I am not sure what that's the complete round that you are talking about. It's the thing I may or may not have signed the receipt for." Then he added, "I signed a receipt for some fragments." Stover was not questioned about the matter by the committee. He told me his entire contact with the committee was 1 or 2 phone calls. What was ironic about the committee's handling of this affair was its reliance on Paul O'Connor and James Jenkins to refute Admiral Osborne. Neither of them, said the committee, could recall any foreign object, specifically a missile, being discovered during the autopsy. But what Purdy and Flanagan didn't know at the time they conducted their investigation was that what Paul O'Connor meant by the opening of the coffin was the arrival of Kennedy's body in a body bag inside a shipping casket, whereas what Admiral Osborne called the coffin opening was the opening of a ceremonial casket after a delay of some time while Humes was waiting for everyone to be there. Moreover, the committee staff seems to have been unaware of the powerful corroboration provided Osborne by the Seibert and O'Neill interview of Ben. My own preoccupation for the Osborne assertion grew when I put the various events on a timeline. The Military District of Washington casket team brought in the casket at 8:00 p.m. Osborne witnessed a casket opening sometime afterward. At 8:50, Secret Service Chief James Rowley turned in the bullet and said it had been found on a Dallas stretcher. Sometime after that, he made a call to Bethesda and told Kellerman that the bullet had been found on a Dallas stretcher. Between 11 and 12 o'clock, according to Seibert and O'Neill, they called the FBI laboratory and first learned that a bullet had been found on a stretcher. The question that had always seemed strange was why, if the Secret Service had the bullet since 2:00 p.m., that they had not notified the FBI laboratory until 8:50 p.m. Air Force One has radio telephones. The FBI could easily have been notified that a bullet had been found and would be delivered after the plane landed. Air Force One landed about 6:00 p.m. Special Agent Johnson's memo indicates it wasn't turned over to Rowley until 7:30. Why a 90-minute further delay before Rowley was told about the bullet? And why another 1 hour and 20-minute delay until 8:50 when the FBI was notified? This peculiar behavior on the part of the Secret Service officials in the handling of this item of evidence only enhanced the credibility of the account of Admiral Osborne. Osborne's account and Stover's corroboration implied the incident was witnessed by others at Bethesda who had chosen to say nothing about it. These would have included Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell and Seibert and O'Neill, who omitted it from their report on the autopsy. Humes' statement to me was not an outright denial. Rather, it was consistent with the view that the bullet was not connected with the body on which he was preparing to do an autopsy. Well, they found a bullet in Dallas, he said, and whether they brought it there or not, I can't tell you. I don't even remember that. I don't know. It was not my problem at that point. Certainly no bullet came with the wrappings of the president. What did Humes mean when he said it was not my problem at that point? I never called back Osborne to find out what explanation Humes provided when he called. The conflict is irreconcilable. Still, I have wondered about the conversation that must have passed between those two men who have been friends for 25 years, when the only alternatives are that one of them imagined he held a bullet, or the other has chosen to remain silent about the incident during the course of all previous government investigations. Well, there you have it. Another very curious and interesting goings-on inside the autopsy. Was it simply that they were not telling the truth about the origin of that bullet? Did they bring the bullet to the autopsy? Was there an indication that they weren't sure how they were going to play the narrative of that bullet until the autopsy began to unfold? Was it a second bullet? All of these questions, of course, remain unanswered. And like I say to you in almost every episode, you can't write this stuff. Thank you for listening to episode 71 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.